for this on wildlife baiting and feeding. I'm Drew Ricketts. I'm the Extension Wildlife Specialist for K-State Research and Extension, and I will be your host and moderator tonight. So during this first session, we're going to hear some presentations from our panel about the science on wildlife baiting and feeding. And during that time, I'd like you to hold your questions. After that, we will have a question and answer session, and we'll talk about some ground rules for that session before we get started with it. And then we will also talk about some ground rules for the open comment period that will come after the question and answer session. So with that, I don't want to take a bunch of time. I'm going to turn it over to Jake, and he will give you some more introductory comments.
Thanks, Drew. I'm actually going to turn it over to Brad, Secretary Lovelace, for some opening remarks. So
Don't sit there.
Oh.
Yeah, thank you, Drew and Jake. It's really our pleasure on behalf of the agency to host this tonight. We're looking forward to sharing information and hearing from the public on their thoughts. And these folks have put in a lot of effort to get ready for this, and we appreciate you making the effort to come out and join us. And I'm anxious to hear the presentations and your thoughts. So thank you. Thank you, Jake.
thanks, Brad. Okay, I can kind of hear myself, so I'm assuming everybody can hear me okay. Let me get out of that screen. So good evening and welcome to the first informational forum on the baiting and feeding of wild game in Kansas. We are planning to have a couple more of these meetings, and I would love to be able to announce that, but unfortunately, logistics of locations and dates for that we don't have for you guys yet, but we will be broadcasting those far and wide as soon as we get those set in stone. I did want to thank Drew and the Kansas State Research and Extension for hosting us here. It's an awesome facility. And a couple reminders, if you have not, please do sign in on the sign-in sheets. There's one at the top of each aisle on those tables. If you could add your name and contact information to that, that will put you on our notification list for any of the future upcoming meetings, as well as any additional information that we have on baiting and feeding that we're wanting to share. Also note, I think a lot of you have already picked them up, but there are some handouts back there on the table. Feel free to pick those up. They may be referenced during our discussion this evening or potentially during the question and answer portion. So my name is Jake George. I'm the Wildlife Division Director for the Kansas Department of Wildlife and Parks. Our panel this evening consists of myself and several of our state wildlife research coordinators. We have Levi Jaster, Matt Peak, and Kent Fricke.
Jake,
Yes.
it is a little hard to hear back here. I don't.
Okay.
know if there's adjustment. Okay.
I have no idea. I can try to talk louder. Is that any better? So there have been a lot of questions asking, what is this meeting about? What is it that we're trying to accomplish here? So it's a good question and a fair question. And if I get the right one, first thing we're going to cover is why we are here. So our reason for putting on these meetings is to share with you our concerns associated with the potential risks baiting and feeding wild game in Kansas. So that's first and foremost, that's the presentation portion of this. After that, we'd like to gather some feedback from you all regarding those concerns. Your input is important to us, and that's a big part of us hosting these meetings. Our goal is to provide everybody with information that you need to help make your own decision as a hunter or a landowner. As well as finally, at the end of this evening, if you do decide baiting and feeding is still something that you're going to continue to do, we'd like to identify some potential alternatives and or some best management practices that you might be able to implement with your baiting and feeding in order to help mitigate some of the risks that are involved. So to follow that up and just to make sure everybody's on the same page, because there have been a lot of questions, I was going to cover some of the reasons as well that we're not here. We're not here to discuss any potential regulatory action. Currently, there are no draft regulations. There are no recommendations before the commission. I believe there was a lot of confusion because of the June commission meeting when we broached this subject with the commission. It was actually in an information session prior to the commission meeting. So our intention was not during a general discussion to begin any regulatory process. It was really to inform the commission that we were going to begin this process of these informational meetings and soliciting some input from the public regarding this topic. We're also not going to be talking about the more subjective opinions regarding ethics of hunting over bait. We're not here to debate the varying motives or objectives of baiting and feeding, such as the need for bait when teaching youth to hunt. There has been, as I said, a lot of information and misinformation that's gone out since the June commission meeting, and hopefully we can alleviate some of that by getting information out to folks. We do acknowledge those concerns that everybody's expressed to us. We're very appreciative of everybody's passion with respect to the topic, but that's not what we're covering this evening. So today, to reiterate, what we're covering is how baiting and feeding results in concentration and increased densities of wildlife. We want to provide you all with information on the resulting potential risks and our concerns regarding those, and to hear your thoughts for the latter part of the evening regarding the information that we present to you all today. So with that, I do thank you all for being here. Your input is important to us, and look forward to the discussion after our presentations.
All right, as Jake mentioned, I'm Kent Fricky, the small game coordinator out of the Emporia Research and Survey Office. And just wanted to give you a little bit more detailed of an overview of the topics that we'll be discussing today in a little bit more graphic form before we move forward. And so again, we're talking about baiting and feeding concerning wildlife. And as Jake mentioned, one of the primary concerns that we as biologists have about this activity on the landscape is that it concentrates wildlife at unnatural densities and different locations. One of the primary concerns is that this increased concentration in wildlife increases contact rates, which has direct implications for disease transmission, specifically wildlife disease transmission. Additionally, as I mentioned, unnatural densities that we see around baiting and feeding sites are of a concern. And two of the primary components that we're going to talk about are habitat degradation around those sites, as well as nuisance and damage issues that our biologists and landowners experience throughout the year. And the other primary components to this, other than the concentration of wildlife, is the overall impacts to wildlife ecology that we're concerned about. Certainly, so we're going to cover aspects of nutrition and aflatoxins. So the things that are being fed and wildlife's intake of those things associated with baiting and feeding. And that has direct implications on survival, reproduction, and health of individuals. Additionally, animal behavior and movement can be altered by these activities and their placement on the landscape. And again, this can have individual and population level effects. Additionally, one of the primary concerns is predators and the acts of predation that we will show are increased around baiting and feeding sites as well. And so that has direct implications for a number of species, but certainly in terms of quail populations and turkey populations, we have significant concerns around those. And so just wanted to give you an overview kind of graphically of what we'll be discussing today. This gives kind of an overview of our primary concerns in terms of concentrations and impacts to wildlife ecology, and then some of the specific topics that we'll be talking about.
All right, I'm Levi Jasper. I'm the Big Game Program Coordinator for KDWP, and we're going to talk a little bit about the cervid disease concerns in Kansas that can relate to baiting and feeding. A lot of literature has been done on this, a lot of research, quite a few papers. This is a very small selection of what's out there to go through, but amassing knowledge on this, and there still continues to be projects to learn more. So just a quick thought of how disease works. with concentrated animals and why that can increase our disease transmission. There's a couple different ways that it can. Just kind of a quick thought on this graph is that on the bottom, the x-axis, that's population density. So, from less to more. And then the contact rate is on the y-axis on the left-hand side of that graph. And one way that it works is that it's density dependent. So more animals in that place, in that area, the more contacts that occur, and you can increase disease transmission, because disease transmission is basically contact rate by the transmission probability of any particular contact. But then there's also another way that it can occur, and that's frequency. And so that is the more times that an individual animal comes in contact or goes to an area that it could possibly get a disease. And so in that case, that may be through contaminated feed or equipment for diseases like tuberculosis and CWD, or even environmental contamination of areas. The other way is as you get in the density and increased density for animals that don't normally congregate at those levels, that causes stress in them. And so that stress then can result in a lowered immune response when they do encounter a disease agent. So the first one, we're going to talk about the elephant in the room of chronic wasting disease. And just a quick look at where we are today with chronic wasting disease. We started up in that northwest corner, that orange that's been there the longest, progressed from our first wild contact or wild detection in 2005 to now 18 years later, where we've now picking it up in the east. And with that, we have some disease zones where we actually look for the disease and do sampling every year, rotating through. And just to kind of give you an idea of where we are, the time that we have CWD definitely plays a major role. And where we've had it first, we see that our prevalence rates are the highest. But that also, part of that is that animals can come in contact more with the disease. And so if you go to the northwest part of the state, you'll see that we're at 24 to 45% based on our sampling from 2020. North Central is a little lower. The Southwest, where we've got some of the lowest densities that occur in the state, has stayed lower, even though it's been there nearly as long as it's been in the North Central. South Central is really low. We've just recently detected the disease there. And then in the East, the detections have been in the last handful of years. So we're still really low. And so I'll now switch to tuberculosis, just because to be respectful of everybody's time here. Tuberculosis, to give you compare a couple of states that have had it. Michigan, there was quite a bit of supplemental feeding was shown to be a predictor of how common the disease was. The infection rate decreased after restrictions were put in place there, but compliance was still pretty poor, and they still have the disease to this day, even though they responded pretty aggressively on shooting deer to try to eliminate it. One of the problems with tuberculosis too is, it's bovine tuberculosis, so deer are a reservoir. So it's a danger to our cattle industry too. It also has the possibility of human transmission in this case. And so people hunting in areas that have it have to be really careful in how they handle deer. We've not had it in our wild deer in Kansas, but we've had a couple of scares where it came in a captive elk and some imported cattle. So it's one that can be pretty, got to be pretty careful of. We've had a scare before. Contrast that with Minnesota, where baiting was illegal since '91. They restricted feeding in 2006. They had really good compliance in the area that they had TB. So the disease didn't become as established. They still had to be pretty aggressive in deer removal, but they haven't had any detections in that area since 2009. So they still monitor it, but a lot of that aggressive response is now lessened because they don't necessarily need to have that. Another one that we do see in Kansas is some hoof disease. And it's a bacterial cause. A wound in the leg can get bacteria and it swells up You know, we think that there's a good chance that muddy areas, soil around feeders where deer are constantly coming in can maintain that bacteria. Just to give you an idea, you see the hind foot of that buck is all swollen up. It can eventually result in deaths. Just to give you an idea of, what we're talking about. The next one that I'm going to talk about is brucellosis. We don't have brucellosis in Kansas, but which is definitely a good thing. It's a huge threat to our cattle industry again, too, because it really restricts what can happen with animals that have it. But elk are definitely a carrier for it, get it. And in Wyoming, where they've had feed grounds in some cases since 1912, they have 60% prevalence of brucellosis at that area. So 60% of your elk have brucellosis. And the exposure is higher at feed grounds from their work out there. And supplemental feeding had the largest effect on those contact rates. In fact, it was twice as much of an effect as anything else that they looked at. And, part of it, the concern with this too, is that, we talk about this and why is it different than deer naturally going to a rub or a salt lick somewhere? And what it is that, we're pretty good at harvesting deer, fooling deer when we really want to be and really buckle down to it. And so what we've done is we've actually, when we put in these artificial sites, deer are more likely to actually spend more time there and come into those. And so what you've got then is more contact either with other animals or in a contaminated environment possibly than what you'd see at those natural areas. And so a lot of it is that if you're in a boat that's leaking, you're not going to bail water into the boat. So with that, I will turn it over to Kent to talk about some habitat impacts.
So in addition to a number of the disease aspects that Levi just covered, there's a number of other aspects that we often may not think of when it comes to the impacts of baiting and feeding. And the first of those is the habitat impacts. And as you can see in the pictures here, the impact of deer and unnaturally high densities of deer can certainly have a high impact on the area surrounding these sites. And so we have localized vegetation degradation by trampling and herbivory efforts. In the bottom right photo, you see a browse line that's been developed from overabundant deer foraging in a small area consistently. And this is not a good sign of overall ecosystem health in that area. We see utilization of desired browse species, which is higher when deer are fed in these areas as well. Overabundant deer have been shown to cause landscape level failure of oak regeneration and has actually changed forest composition in portions of the eastern United States. And so, again, these concentrations of deer beyond disease impacts also have direct habitat implications. And associated with that is also reduction of rare and native forb species as well. Studies have documented, in this case, the flower shown here, Trillium, being wiped out of areas and can be a good indicator of ecosystem health in that you have few enough deer that these species can still persist on the landscape. And so this is all using information from browsing and flowering rates and age structure, and makes a big difference in terms of how we assess local deer populations and overall ecosystem health. In addition, there's impacts that have been shown on other species when you have overabundant deer populations. Overbrowsing has caused bumblebee decline and impairs pollination rates. Declining songbird species richness, so the number of different species out there on the landscape, and abundance have decreased with increasing deer density. And recovery of small mammals have been shown that after we reduce deer populations in an area where they were overly abundant, we then see recovery of other mammal species in that environment. And so there's a lot of impacts that beyond whether there's deer there or not, or abundant deer or not, there's impacts that these things are having on the landscape. In addition, some of the things that our field biologists work with daily in terms of landowners is nuisance and damage issues. Certainly crop damage can be a development, especially when in areas where you have a feeder that's put on the corner of a property, for example, that abuts a neighbor with a cornfield or soybean field. And all of a sudden that neighbor starts seeing that corner start declining in terms of yield and production. So we deal with that a lot on a daily basis. Additionally, when deer are concentrated and moving consistently to a single area, especially around roads, you see increases in deer vehicle collisions. And then you also see in terms of other things beyond just deer, we see, because we know not just deer are going to these feeders, we see increases in instances of poultry predation when you have more raccoons and different predator species starting to access these baiting and feeding sites. And then certainly, again, damage to gardens and orchards in the same way, in that when you have these overly abundant populations attracting other species as well, we see damage and get complaints and calls about these things having a real impact on other people's lives too. And as I mentioned earlier, there are impacts to non-target species. So several studies have found that turkeys constrain movements when feeders are on the landscape. They begin using those areas and changing their movement patterns from areas that are not feeded or not fed to areas that are fed. And we also see bobwhite quail select areas that are closer to feeders. Now, that in and of itself may not be a huge deal, but this leads to the potential for increased predation of those ground nesting species. Several studies have looked at the number of different species and number of individuals of each species that attend each of these feeders and congregate at them. And as many in this room who have had a camera, wildlife camera over a deer feeder, roughly 80% in research studies so far, 80% of photos typically show non-target species, so non-deer. And of course, most of those are raccoons, especially in this landscape. And so what that then does is that affects the distribution of feeders, increases the probability of overlap between both predators and those ground nesting birds that are relating to those feeders as well. And supplemental food has been shown to affect nest success from artificial nests. As you get closer to those feeders, they have more of an impact and more of a likelihood to be predated. Additionally, beyond just nest predators, both bobcats and red-tailed hawks have been shown to increase their usage of areas that are associated with baiting and feeding sites as well. And so again, beyond just deer, there's a number of other species that we feel are important considerations in this conversation. And with that, I just wanted to kind of transition us now from, now we're kind of transitioning from the concentration of wildlife and what those increased densities can mean more to an impact of what those wildlife are actually ingesting on the landscape.
All right, so, in Kansas, deer tend to be much more cover limited than they are food limited, finding that escape cover. There's been some very good research done that does show that food can be a limiting factor in many cases, although often that research has been done in the Southeast, in the Pine Barrens, and also in Texas, and even down in Southwest Kansas. We're pretty dry, but we're not, West Texas desert. And so we're also in the central portion of the whitetails range, so we don't see the winter kill that you would see farther north. Not that we don't maybe lose a few that are already weakened and such. And so, but just a quick, deer are ruminants, but they're not cattle. Cattle have a very big rumen, relatively small liver to that. They eat, it's more about volume. Quality certainly helps, but they need the volume for sure. Deer are a concentrate selector. They need the really good high quality nutrition. They have a very small rumen, but then they have a very large liver to deal with that. So deer engage in diet balancing. And so they tend to mix what they eat to meet their nutritional needs. But they also have to balance that many of the plants that they do eat have some sort of chemical in them that is a toxin potentially if they eat, especially if they eat too much of it. And so, they have to balance that toxicity against their nutritional needs. It's also why they have that big liver to help deal with a lot of that stuff and filter it out and get rid of it. And they need to bring in more energy than they spend. If you spend more than you bring in, you're eventually going to die from it. And so that diversity of forage is really important to maintain a good diet and health. Deer don't live, they don't just go see the vet for our wild deer. So they basically have to live in their medicine cabinet. And there's some work that has shown that they do particularly select certain things when they do need it. But why are they attracted to grain? Well, it's a starch. It's easy to digest. It ferments very readily. It can provide that burst of energy. That's the number one nutrient a body needs every day is energy. And so what happens is you get this flavor feedback loop where the body, they get that burst of energy, goes, oh, this is good. What is this? What did I just eat? That feels really good. Okay, that's it. I should eat more of that. So if you really want to think about it, as potato chips and us. Rarely do you open the bag of potato chips and eat just one. But that high grain diet can cause some issues. Rumen acidosis is a possibility. That's much more of a problem if you're not had any grain at all and then suddenly have a lot of grain. Deer up in far north, when people dump a bunch of corn in the hard winter, can be found with a full stomach and have starved to death because they can't digest it. They've got that bacteria in their rumen, can't deal with it. But you can still have some chronic issues that may not necessarily kill the deer, but could reduce their health. We also have some hoof disease that we do see in Kansas, or hoof deformation once in a while, just excessive growth from that high starch. There's also some other potential issues. Some of the more major ones are neurological, blindness, seizures. Minor, you get diarrhea, bloat, lethargy. But those are, lethargy could be a problem where they're going to, be more susceptible to predation. But, why don't we see a bunch of dead deer out there? Well, they're adaptable. They can do that diet mixing to help lessen some of the problems. That small rumen, they process stuff through really quickly. So that helps limit that diet mixing again, variety of plants. And it's also really difficult to actually find dead deer. Even people that are trained to do it and follow a search pattern, only find 1 in 10 when they're looking for deer. And we see that when we're looking for animals like die from EHD, where you can have a large volume die very quickly. If you're not looking for it, it's more like 1 in 100 or more. So the next problem is aflatoxins I'm going to get into. It's a chemical that's made by fungus. So, moldy corn. If you got moldy corn, that's where it's coming from. And, in that case, it's a fungus. It grows in warm, moist environments. Sudden changes like an increase or decrease in temperature can cause it to really make a lot of aflatoxin. And the toxins can last a lot longer than the fungi. You can kill the fungi and you still have aflatoxins around. By volume, aflatoxins are considered one of the most toxic substances to vertebrates in the world. It's also carcinogenic. In fact, in third world countries, it's one of the leading causes of cancer. And it negatively affects most of the systems in a vertebrate's body. So, we can even start with clean corn and we can get to high levels of aflatoxins relatively quickly. Even starting from none by, day 4 or 5, it's starting to grow. When we look at grain in this country, 20 parts per billion is the threshold for human food and some of our livestock feeds. But we can reach 3,000 parts per billion relatively quickly, usually up to 7 days, sometimes even sooner if it's the right conditions. Dosage is important. For some songbirds, they actually start having reproductive issues at 20 parts per billion. Turkeys tend to be affected at 200 parts, as you can see by that red line there. And then deer, they're larger animals, so larger animals tend to have less issues. And so deer start being affected at 800 parts per billion. But there's some short and long-term effects. You can, high amounts of it rapidly can kill an animal outright from it. But then you can also have some long-term. It can cause liver damage. And, in a deer where you need that big liver to function really well, having loss of function can really hurt you that way. There's also some work that's shown that the parent ingesting aflatoxin can actually pass that to offspring in utero or in ova, so even into the egg as they process eggs through for turkeys. You can have a case where potentially even the fetus or the chick can die before they're even born or hatched from it. And so I will now turn it over to Matt.
All right, thank you, Levi. Matt Peak, I'm out of the Emporia Research and Survey Office. The previous speakers have described some of the concerns we have about feeding and baiting of wildlife in Kansas. I'm going to switch gears now and find a little bit of middle ground by providing some of the recommendations or best management practices that we would recommend people do with the knowledge that a lot of people are going to continue feeding and baiting. Okay, so these are some alternatives that will account for some of our concerns anyway. So beginning with reducing aflatoxin risk. One of the things you can do if you have a feeder that's distributing a certain amount of grain out, like on a daily basis or on a timer or something like that, you should try to limit the amount of feed that's being put out to basically what they're consuming in a given day. So like Levi's graph shows, within 3 days, they start developing aflatoxin. As long as you're turning that grain over relatively rapidly, that reduces the risk levels. Another thing is to clean and maintain your feeders. If you've ever opened up a feeder and found a clump of wet grain in there because it rained and somehow it got under your lid, your feeder is a problem. That is what the problem that we're talking about, is that wet grain right there. And so you need to find a way, either put something over the top of that or get a different feeder so that the water can't get in on the corn. And along those same lines, if that happens, it's probably time to clean that feeder out before you put it back into use. Another thing you can do is only feed grains that have been tested and passed USDA levels for livestock. So Levi mentioned that there are USDA levels for livestock that start at something like 20 parts per million. Those do not apply to feed that's being sold as wildlife feed. So I would guess a lot of the stuff that's sold in stores has been tested for aflatoxin, but if you're going to the grain elevator, you might ask them and make sure that it has been tested. When they get grain that is high, that doesn't pass for livestock, they've got 3 choices. They can either dilute it with grain and try to bring it down to the appropriate level. They can discard it and take the financial loss, or they can sell it as wildlife feed or deer corn, which isn't regulated. So be aware of those things and make sure you're not starting out, back to this graph here, make sure you're not starting out with grain that's already above one of those red lines. Another thing you can do is feed milo rather than corn. It's less susceptible to aflatoxin. And then a better thing yet is to feed protein supplements rather than grains, which of course grains are more susceptible than protein supplements. And then the things you should avoid, the worst thing you can do is take a huge amount of grain and dump it out there in a pile. A pile of grain is just the same as that wet grain in your feeder. Those piles of grain are conducive to getting wet and drawing moisture and then growing aflatoxin. And when you dump big piles out there, they're out there for an extended period of time when, the potential for aflatoxin development, again, back to this slide right here, is high. If they're not eating it within, say, 3 or 4 days, you start running the risk. As far as reducing contact rates and habitat degradation, the main thing we recommend is not feeding deer during March through October. This is the growing season for natural native vegetation in Kansas, and that's when it's most available. And so feeding is not necessary during those times from a nutritional perspective. It's also worth noting that most of the reasons why people feed have to do with hunting, and those are things that take place in the later fall or winter. So, you know, the middle ground here is you can still take advantage and have some of those benefits of the fall and winter feeding or baiting. Not that we would recommend that, but at least take it out this time of year. Okay. Again, that was also, I think I skipped over that, but March through October was also the time of year when aflatoxin was most likely to develop in those seeds due to temperatures and precipitation. So yeah, that was an important component of aflatoxin as well. And let your habitat determine contact rates and other aspects of deer contact at that time during those times of year. And then the other thing is harvest management. If you're feeding deer, you should recognize that it concentrates densities in a given area. So, you know, take responsibility for the herd on your land and maintain the balance between the deer and the habitat. One of the main ways to do that is to be looking for browse lines and looking at plant species and trails coming in and stuff like that. Most everybody runs cameras, so they probably have some idea of how many deer are there. And our deer biologist Levi could certainly tell you what the average is in that area. But I can tell you, if you're seeing 30, 40 deer on your feeders, that's a lot for most of the year. Relative to reducing concentrated predator species, the first thing I would mention is feeder placement. Kent mentioned the studies that show increased depredation rates around feeders. So try to keep your feeders away from nesting and brood rearing habitat. And that primarily means good established native grass, as well as that's the nesting. And then the brood rearing is early successional stuff. And so if you have areas that have been, strip disced, or that are grown up in sunflowers and ragweed, stuff like that, those are the places the mom wants to take the baby birds to eat the insects and stuff. And so try to keep your feeders away from those areas. You know, all the raccoons and bobcats and hawks are coming to those feeders already. And then again, harvest management. Most of you don't maybe want a trapper or a hunter out there on your place during the middle of the season, but you need to find. We would recommend that you find something that's compatible with your activities. And I would say that the department is in the process of extending the coon and possum seasons potentially to year round right now. So that may give you some more time to do that. But the traditional way this has been done with fur harvesters in the winter, I would say that there is still a possibility, even though fur markets aren't great, there's still a possibility of using those people, and you can consider letting them work the perimeters of properties. They can still impact populations along fence lines or where creeks run onto properties without going into the middle of the property where the feeder is and stuff like that. So consider some different options outside the box and find a way to get those coon numbers under control. Some alternatives to feeding and baiting that still provide a whole lot of nutrition for wildlife, and you could still hunt in these areas, provide great hunting opportunities as well. The main thing people think about are food plots, but there's a variety of other things you can do, like strip disking to produce a bunch of early successional forbs that deer love to browse on, the things that deer should naturally be eating, as well as things like cover crops in agriculture. And then timber stand improvement is a big thing in a lot of the state. You've got a lot of overly mature and poor quality timber out there and woodland that, like this picture here, there's hardly any understory there. Okay, if you go in there and thin the trees out and possibly hinge cut some of them, I do a lot of this on my own land, and this thinning creates a huge explosion of buckbrush and understory, including new trees. And again, the things that deer want to naturally browse on. And then that's the type of area I hunt, is like in this picture right here, other than this is the before. So. And then I also wanted to mention that Wildlife and Parks, the Wildlife Division, has a Habitat First program that we pay cost share for a number of those different things I mentioned. And so anybody who cares enough about wildlife that I think is a hunter and cares about wildlife should consider some of these Habitat improvement options as an alternative and see how they fit in and whether you can meet some of your same objectives that way without the risk of increased contact rates and stuff like that. So I think I will turn this back over now to Jake.
Okay, thanks, Matt. I'm going to wrap things up. I do thank everybody for your attention during the presentation portion of the evening. That was a lot of information to throw at you. And believe it or not, we cut that back 3 or 4 times from the information that we would have liked to have presented. So I'm hoping that some of those questions come up during the Q&A portion so that we can elaborate on some of those things that we did cut out of the presentation for time's sake, because we really did want to get to the interactive portion of the evening where we can get some input from you all. I did want to reiterate some of the key takeaways just because it was a lot of information. Those primarily being that baiting and feeding can result in unnatural concentration and increased densities of wildlife. If you take away nothing else from this, take away the fact that baiting and feeding can result in increased concentrations and densities of wildlife. This can lead to higher contact rates, which can increase the rates and spread for diseases, as well as habitat degradation and increased predation, which can negatively impact non-target species. That feeding only grains at best has poor nutritional value and at worst potentially detrimental has detrimental nutritional impacts. And that the improper and or untimely baiting or feeding does lead to an increased risk of elevated aflatoxin levels in the feed. And this can lead to increased mortality, decreased reproductive success. And, you know, it is something that's difficult to measure. It's a big unknown for us as far as the overall impact on the landscape. We don't know that. That's a big unknown. But we do know, based on controlled studies, the causes of increased levels of aflatoxin, and we understand the levels at which it impacts various species. And finally, if you're going to bait or feed, consider implementing some of the best management practices that Matt outlined today. Or preferably, if you do forego baiting and feeding, you can put your efforts into habitat improvement projects on your property or consider food plots as an alternative. So as far as closing thoughts, after hearing all this, the question that we're hoping that you would ask yourself is baiting and supplemental feeding worth the risk to the wildlife resource? So we encourage you to avoid baiting and feeding and consider some of those alternatives that we've outlined as habitat management and food plots. And with that, we do thank you again for your time and attention. We are, as we start into the question and answer portion of this, going to be passing out a questionnaire that we're hoping you guys would complete to provide some feedback to us. And with that, we'll kind of move into the next section of it.
Panel ready to jump into questions? Like 5 minutes.
I think we're okay.
Okay. All right, so ground rules. We have an open question and answer time. Raise your hand. I'll bring you the mic. If you have the mic, you're the speaker. If you don't have the mic, you're not the speaker. So during this point in time, you have the opportunity to ask a question of the panel. The panel will provide you an answer. You can have one follow-up question, and then we're going to move to somebody else. And if we have time, we'll come back to everybody again. Okay, we want to make sure that everybody gets an opportunity to ask their questions and get them answered. So if you're ready with a question, raise your hand and I'll bring the mic to you and you can get started.
I guess my question is, bottom line, we got some good experts here today. As the biologist, what's your consensus? Do you really feel that we should eliminate baiting? I want to know your truthful answer.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
It's
Yes,
loud. Putting us right on the spot, huh?
right away.
So I don't think that there is a consensus amongst all of us, even within the department, there's disagreement on whether or not we have enough information at this point to
Mhm.
outright recommend a complete prohibition on baiting and feeding,
Okay.
which is why we've gone the route of expressing our concerns and hoping that people will implement change on their own and make those decisions for themselves.
Okay, thanks.
Who's next?
I would like to have more than like 5 minutes. I'm Representative Lewis Bloom, and I'm on my counties are Clay, Dickinson, Riley, and Cloud. I'm on the Ag Budget Committee in the Capitol. Ken Corbett is the chairman. And he can't come tonight, but he told me his feelings. I talked to Mr. Lovelace at the Randolph Rifle Range a couple months ago, and he said this was a dead issue. And now here it is again. If you would, I've just written some notes down here, so I haven't gone over them, of what you said. And I would like to rebut some of the things you said, and then you can have at me when I get done. Is that okay?
Sir, at the end, after the question and answer session, we're gonna have opportunity for comment and this sort of back and forth like you're.
I would like 5 minutes whenever time I could get it.
Sure, after the question and answer session, then
Okay.
we'll give it.
That'll be great.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate it. Okay, questions? Yeah, he's hand up first, so I'll get him.
Floyd Snyder, South Osage City. Hi, Brad. I've got a couple quick questions. This was put out as an informational session. We were handed a sheet that has approximately 24 references. I briefly read through the synopsis on them, and every one of them appears to be anti-baiting. If it's truly informational, when are we going to have a session that is pro-baiting so we can evaluate both sides? Second question, can we get a copy of the PowerPoint?
Yeah, we can certainly make the PowerPoint available, and actually they are recording the meeting, so the whole presentation and our discussions will be available afterwards. What we're expressing today are our concerns as wildlife biologists for the resource. So we were not trying to make an argument that baiting should be banned. So it wasn't intended to be an us versus them. It's an information regarding our concerns and things that we would like people to consider when they are practicing baiting and feeding on the landscape.
Okay, I looked up a real quick thing online, ran across an article that was very balanced on pro and con baiting. It's not hard to find.
So the document that you have in front of you is selected resources. There's many, many more. I think I cut down even just from our relatively short list of 5 pages down to that. But each of the references noted there are peer-reviewed scientific literature. They're not, none of them are pro or against. They are scientific studies done to examine the effects of bait or feed or whatever the case may be for the individual study. We'd be happy to share those individual studies with you. We have those available, to email to you. But they are the scientific research that's been done on these topics.
So you're implying that there's no scientific research that actually supports baiting.
There may be. These are the ones that we felt were most relevant. And whether, again, I guess my point would be, they're not supporting for or against. They're scientific studies that were done with hypotheses of, is there an effect of, how long does it take to, for aflatoxin to grow on deer or grow on corn in a controlled setting, those kind of things.
I was just going to say that the scientific community is largely, I think the consensus on this within the scientific community is what it is, largely because of all the research that's been done. So the Wildlife Society, you know, the premier association of professional wildlife biologists in the country, has a statement that largely points out many of the concerns that are out there. I think wildlife veterinarians are overwhelmingly in the same field, and it is because of the overwhelming amount of research that shows negatives associated with it. So there are some positives out there. Levi mentioned some. You know, if you're talking about feeding deer in, you know, perhaps in northern Minnesota or Maine or something like that, in places where you have a large amount of winter kill, or in West Texas desert country, it may have some significant benefits. Those things are minimal. Those things specifically don't apply at all to Kansas, but you know, the number of things where the number of benefits that apply to Kansas are minimal relative to wildlife health. Now, there are a lot of different good reasons why people feed and bait, or bait in particular, related to hunting. And we all know that it's important to a lot of people in regards to hunting, but we were primarily focused on wildlife health today. And the wildlife health benefits in Kansas are minimal, is the position that I think we have.
Kind of off those statements you made, we've been very fortunate over the last, I'm going to say 10 to 15 years, having very mild winters. Grown up out in the country in Kansas, central Kansas, I can remember days and years and years and decades when we used to stare at snow outside our windows of our houses. Used to be days before we could get roads open, and we had large mass kills. Now, I'm not going to get into anything at all when it comes into greenhouse effect or anything, but we've been fortunate. We've had great winters. Information you guys made is great. I mean, it really is. I mean, to pour out on the ground a pile of corn that's got mildew and mold in it, been laying in the bottom of a silo, absolutely agree with you 1,000%. I wouldn't want to eat it. Deer don't like to eat it. Most of the times they won't eat it. We're going through a period right now that off of the feeders, I'm running right now about 48 cameras. And off of the feeders, the deer are totally off of them now because of the harvest we have going on in the corn. But you go to any cornfield and the deer are covered in it. That corn will lay there from spillage overage all year long. And it will mildew, it will begin to come. Everything you guys said is great, and it's been a real challenge here the last 6 months. It really has been. But a question I got for you, when you show that we have 45 to 50% infection rate up in the northwest corner of tested animals, of suspect tested animals, we have Colorado and Nebraska up there that do not permit feeding. Why is the rate the highest up there? Is a question I have for you. Why in Indiana and Illinois, where baiting is not allowed, do they have some of the highest CWD rates in the nation, that they have never allowed feeding in those areas? It's just a question I have, and believe me, there's nobody doesn't want any disease, but the worst CWD right now is car wasting disease. A lot worse harvest than we have from anything. As far as moving deer into an area, a lot of times feeders hold deer into an area, and we do prevent a lot of that. But I do want the question answered about the northwest corner. If you can, please, you know, why are numbers, and I know there's been more testing up there, but why are the other states have such a high rate when they do not permit feeding? Thanks, guys.
Well, I'll start with one thing on the rates. Those are not our sick and suspect animals. We strip those out. Those rates are from our hunter harvested animals. And if a hunter harvests an animal that looks sick, that gets counted as a suspect. So in that sense, basically it's a hunter harvest, so I won't necessarily say it's a random sample of the population. To do that, we'd have to actually go shoot deer, which, you know, we can't do. We can't do that on the scale that some of these other states have done. As far as seeing those rates grow, when you look at some of those other states, Wyoming, Colorado, some of their rates are high or higher because they've had it longer. And that's definitely a big factor in CWD is how long it's been there. And so they've had it longer, they can get higher rates than we've had. If you look at it for the same amount of time, you know, it may come more there. There's also a lot of mitigating factors. When you look at our northwest corner of Kansas, our deer densities are low when you compare it to a lot of these other states. And so that helps limit it too. It's also one of those things that's kind of a conundrum when you start looking at CWD management across that, because a lot of states, when they talk about reducing deer numbers, we're starting well below what they're even trying to get to. So like Illinois shoots a lot of deer every year for this. Missouri shoots a lot of deer. Now in those middle of those, they've definitely got hot spots, you know, and the rates are up. You get outside of that, you start getting a bullseye, it starts getting less and less. But it minimizes that contact rate of those animals moving away from there. You know, where baiting and feeding comes in is that you're creating that point that maximizes that contact and the frequency of it. You know, the frequency is all about the individual animal coming back to it. So that, you know, one time walking through a room with sick people, you may not get sick. You keep going back to that room, now you're going to expose yourself a lot more often. The other thing is then the dosage. You know, nobody's quite sure what the dosage of prions that a deer has to get CWD. And so when you keep bringing that animal back to an area that has a higher level of contamination, you keep increasing that chance of getting that dosage high enough to get it. And, you know, with that, we don't know if it's a cumulative, they've got to be exposed so many times to so much of it and build it up, or if it's a one-time thing. And so that's where trying to minimize those sites where they're going to encounter that is important.
Question or comment? No, okay.
So in high fence areas where we have study areas of deer, if we have any of those prions in there, we should have, because those deer are being fed almost entirely by supplemental feed. We should have almost all those deer infected if we have one deer in there, and that's not occurring. If so, we'd have all these high fence areas shut down. Not a high fence fan, but why aren't we? You know, why aren't we having a mass kill off of those deer? And I know, but so basically the question I'm going to ask you, the science ain't there yet to really know if this is a problem. Everything you guys said was great about feeders. You're right. Spin feeder broadcast is much better than ever dumping. I agree with that 100%. It's better for the animals because deer are browsers. But I am curious because I don't want to lose our deer that we have. I really don't. And when our numbers have gone up dramatically over the last few years, I mean, it's a constant up on our numbers. So the disease isn't just overwhelming, isn't overtaking. Still hard for me to fathom that we have high fences, that we have those prions in, those deer ain't all dead. And we also have in the northwest corner where we have areas that have absolutely no feeding, no baiting of any kind, and our numbers are higher? Or are you testing in those areas more? I hate to use COVID, but you run 1,000. Yes.
Let's let him answer your question. We'll have comment period later.
So again, in some cases, you know, it's the time, you know, once you've got an animal in there that's infected, then how long, you know, it takes time for those prions to build up in there. And, you know, again, like I said, we don't necessarily know the dose. And so, you know, if it's a fairly high dose and it's animal to animal contact, it's going to spread it. You've got to have enough of that contact to build that dose up, or get an animal sick enough that they're in contact. In some cases too, with testing, you know, when it's really early in having CWD, we can't pick it up. The test isn't sensitive enough to find it there. So it's got to build up to a level to where you can actually see it. And so in some cases where it says that, you know, it's a false negative, basically. The test just isn't good enough to see it in those cases. In some cases, those animals may be passing through that facility fast enough that they're never getting to that point too. The other side of that is, you know, you have to get that first sick animal in there. And so in some cases, that fence may be protecting those animals inside from our wild deer to not get it there. You know, that's why we encourage those folks, you know, captive deer are under Department of Ag here, not Wildlife and Parks. But we certainly encourage those folks to maintain their fences very well. You know, it's not just protecting our wild herd, it's protecting themselves. And so it's in their best interest.
All right, please ask questions. A question should take about 30 seconds. We'll have comment period later, okay?
I guess my question is, how serious of a problem does Wildlife and Parks consider baiting to be as a cause of chronic wasting? And I don't know if I can say that. I started hunting the second year that Kansas had deer, or in 1969. I started hunting in Colorado in 1971. I hunted out of the same base camp for 35 years. There is absolutely no baiting whatsoever within miles of where I hunt in Colorado, and yet they have chronic wasting. All I'm trying to say is I have a feeling there must be some other cause of chronic wasting, and I don't know how important baiting is. You know, how big of a cause do you think it is? 100%, 50%, 2%? I think there's a question in there somewhere.
It's complicated because different places can have different reasons of why it's a problem. Again, some of those places out in Colorado, you know, if it's animal to animal, then it's, you know, animals passing it on. If it's environmental, then over time, because prions don't get destroyed or broken down very easily, and they can persist in soil in places for years, decades, potentially. Over time, you can build up that environmental contamination. And that's where, you know, baiting sites can just have that contamination built up very high, very quickly, because you've got so many animals coming in. And if they're shedding those prions in there, in that area, then you're going to have more. So it's a problem there. You know, regarding CWD, you know, baiting and feeding is the problem when it shows up. Prior to that, for CWD, you know, if you don't have CWD, then it's not spreading there, but it's, you know, the other risk of it. And then it's, you know, it's hard to pick it up when it first shows up. We rarely detect it right away. It's got to, you know, typically with our sampling in Kansas that we can do logistically and financially, we're not going to pick it up until it's about 1%. You know, sometimes we get lucky. We've had years where we tested 2 deer, you know, and I say lucky, and as in we won the worst lottery I can think of, is that we sampled, you know, 1 deer in 1 county and got CWD. Do I think that that county is 100% CWD prevalence? No. You know, that's the deer we got. But it's certainly with that environmental contamination, and they've done it in captive facilities where they've gone in and removed a lot of the soil and put new deer animals back in there after a few years. And, you know, for a while they're okay, but then eventually they still have CWD show up, even though they've not brought any new animals in. And that animal came from an area that had not, or facility that did not have CWD detected before. So, you know, it's tough. And then there's some cases where it can spontaneously arise. It's, you know, just another event where that protein misfolded and popped up. They saw that in, I believe, Finland with caribou. And then they had a case in New York. They're not sure that that's the case, but it's the only deer they've ever had detected with CWD. And they harvested a lot of deer out of that area, shot a lot, and, you know, they've not had a detection since in that case. So it's really complicated, but it's certainly a risk. And, you know, personally, I won't have baiting on my farm.
I might try to answer that real quickly. The reason that CWD is at 45% in northwest Kansas and 0.1% in southeast Kansas is because CWD hasn't been in southeast Kansas. And so the concern is, but feeding and baiting doesn't cause CWD by itself, but the concern is once it gets there, that it could increase the time that we get to 45% in southeast Kansas. We don't know to what degree or to what extent it may speed it up, but the fear is that the increased contact rates there would cause it to get to what it could get, to what it will potentially get to over time quicker.
It's big enough that we're bringing it up and talking about it as a, something to be concerned about. But is it the cause? Is it the number one thing to take care of in this case? Maybe not, but it's still important enough we need to have the discussion about it.
I have a question about, do we have a baseline? Do we know what the population estimate is of the deer statewide? We know it varies by region, but what does that graph look like now as opposed to maybe the last 10 years? What's that population density look like?
Statewide, it's increased slightly, but if you break it down by region, major declines in the west are covered up by gains in the east. If you were to try to balance Kansas on where by, number of deer in an area, Emporia probably wouldn't be a terrible spot to actually, try to balance that, maybe a little bit west of that. But with the numbers out west, some of those units, we're talking 2 to 5 deer per square mile average. We all know deer aren't evenly distributed. There's pockets where they're a lot more. There's some areas that there's not very many. So, out there, in some cases out there, it's in some years, it's, we pick it up as lower. You go to Unit 12, Chautauqua, Montgomery County. Some of those areas, we've had it recently as high as almost 30 deer per square mile down there. So, looking at it from just a statewide standpoint, it doesn't necessarily tell the story very well because gains in the east cover up those declines in the west. And so then that's, gains in areas that either we've never detected CWD or it's been detected at very low prevalence rates versus areas that, we've picked it up fairly high.
We really don't have a number of the actual deer. Like there's 500,000 deer, 600,000 deer. We don't have that number for the last.
About 700
Gotcha.
The last couple of years.
Do we know the harvest total of deer annually and what that looks like between like last year and going back 10 years?
We've been actually fairly stable the last few years on harvest. Last year's number is about 81,000. We've kind of bounced around that. About 10, not quite, or a little more than 10% of our overall there.
Yeah, my question is why hasn't anything been said tonight about the University of Wisconsin's research into chronic wasting disease being a tick-borne illness?
There's some that's there. I'm not super familiar with that. I'd have to talk to our disease biologist specifically about it. But there's other facilities where animals are treated and possibly that's the case, but I've not seen enough evidence to say that that's for sure.
I can comment on that. Brand new paper that just came out, if you're talking about the same one that I just read. And what the paper indicated was that it's possible, that's the same one. It's possible for ticks to potentially transfer prions from one animal to another, but it's never been documented. So they don't know that it's a tick-borne illness, but there is the possibility that ticks could be one vector for spreading those infectious prions from animal to animal. Okay, I've got a question here. What is the target prevalence rate for managing chronic wasting disease?
Lower is certainly better. You know, Kansas is likely at a point where we're gonna have to figure out how to live a long time with this. We're past the point of other states' responses where they first had a detection and it's, what do we do? And, can we shoot deer? Trying to minimize it and implement, harvest goals and look at that in ways that, hopefully maintains that prevalence low at lower rates. Possibly reducing it. They've been able to do that in some places. You're not going to eliminate it ever. But it's also a difficult thing because when where we've got highest prevalence, that's also where our mule deer herd is our best numbers so far, although that's, kind of a sad realization of where our mule deer are right now. And so it definitely complicates how we can implement harvest strategies and targets. And, Colorado's gone to the point of, how do we work towards managing our herds in a way that, minimizes the chance of increasing those rates. But, also realizing that, we're not going to necessarily get rid of CWD.
Yeah, thanks. Levi, I wanted to ask you, a couple of years ago, I asked you a similar question. It seemed to me, and this might not be a good number anymore, but at the time I was thinking you said, maybe if we could keep it under 5%, that might be a target. I don't know if you still put any weight into that, but I remember us talking about that.
Yeah, there's been some work that suggests that if we can maintain prevalence rates below 10%, that helps mitigate some of the factors of population declines. Basically what they've seen looking at various populations of deer and elk around the country, and evaluating, the differences between those shows that about 10%, once you pass that level, your population doesn't really grow anymore. It struggles there. That number, if I recall correctly, is your total herd prevalence. And I will say that the numbers that I showed tonight tend to be focused much more on those adult bucks. So those bucks that are 2.5 years or older, because that's what we get the vast majority of our samples from, because a lot of our samples come from taxidermists. And so, that's what people are targeting for the most part. That's what's going to taxidermists. People aren't, hauling a whole lot of does to the taxidermist and paying $500 to put a doe head on the wall. And so, in that sense, it would be nicer to get a lot more doe samples. And we've, put in for kind of a first come, first serve opportunity now that allows statewide sampling, that we cover the cost of the test rather than the hunter having to directly do that. You just have to get us the sample or be willing to cover the cost of shipping it to the K-State lab. So I'd highly encourage folks to get those samples in so we can include that kind of number. But that 10% level is kind of what some work has shown as kind of being that point where there's potentially no return. That's, it's not necessarily the end all be all, but that's the number that was put in. But, definitely 5%, that gives you that room to where if something, you can possibly increase your herd even. So other stuff, because, we could have an EHD outbreak in some cases. Might be, useful in that maybe it kills a lot of those CWD positive animals. That would be fantastic, but I'm not going to hold my breath either. But, we need to be able to recover from that afterwards. And that's where the real insidious part of CWD is, not just that it kills animals, but then you lose your ability to recover after other events too.
Where you come up with your number? How do you get your numbers?
Which numbers?
The head counts.
The head counts, we do spotlight population surveys in the fall.
Okay. And how do you get your harvested deer numbers?
We do a postseason harvest survey. So about 40,000 deer hunters get sent a survey to fill out. I then usually get about 12 to 15,000 of those back. And then we can use that information to apply that to all our deer hunters and get a number. So it's an estimate, and it's going to have a confidence interval that basically says that, you know, this is the number we came up with. It could be potentially this high, it could be potentially that low. And it's, you know, in fact, we been working on it for this coming year, and, you know, it's also the opportunity to get that other information, but it's a harvest estimate for sure. But we don't necessarily need to know the exact number that's harvested on a statewide basis. You know, on a smaller area, you know, if you're talking about your own farm, you know, you probably need to know that exact number. But when we're managing at a deer management unit level, you know, if I'm looking at harvest levels, then do I need to also consider, you know, how many deer vehicle accidents killed deer potentially, which we don't even know that number. I know how many accidents were reported, but I don't necessarily know that. I don't know how many animals are necessarily dying from disease either. But if I have a general idea, you know, that gives us a target for that large of an area. You know, it's all about the scale you're working at too.
Over here. So my question is a little bit not necessarily just on feeding, but on disease mitigation strategies. When we look at specifically chronic wasting disease, look at all the different factors and all the research and all the studies. I read a lot of it, and there's a lot of what ifs. Now there are some that we know pretty certain. If we have decomposing carcasses in the same paddock and 2 years later put new fresh animals in, they will come down with CWD. Why has the department not taken a stronger stance on carcass care, carcass disposal, burial, compost, incineration, and basically getting rid of that transport? Why has that not been a major emphasis? And I guess why is feeding?
We're addressing that part of it actually currently. We're having discussions with our commission about carcass transport and that kind of stuff. And not just carcass transport within the state, but also bringing carcasses from other places. So.
Additional questions before we move on to comment period?
If we're thinking that CWD is density dependent and Eastern Kansas has higher density of deer, we're at the 0.1 to 0.7 positive range. Out west, lower densities are at up to 40 to 50. How fast is that increase are you guys expecting Eastern Kansas to get to before?
So CWD isn't necessarily density dependent. It's actually mixed between that frequency and density. So frequency is all about the individual, and then over times you're in contact with that person. The example that's usually given is it's like an STD. You know, you're not necessarily in contact with the whole population in that case, but it's repeated contact with a particular individual. Frequency is you're just having lots of contact with a whole lot of people. You know, that would be the equivalent of, you know, just basically walking through a room with a whole lot of people. With, you know, fewer people, there's less chance in density. But it certainly complicates it because at the beginning, it certainly acts like a density where you've got more animals in there. And so there's more opportunity for those contacts. But eventually it hits a point where even more animals on top of that isn't going to increase the chance of an animal getting CWD. It's more about frequency of contact with either another sick animal or a contaminated environment.
I think we had one more question over here somewhere.
Hello, my name is Dwayne. I appreciate the information you put together, but I would like to see some more details behind that, if that's possible, that you could publish or put out there. We've all talked about these numbers in the northwest corner, and Levi, I'm not trying to put you on the spot, but if you guys could put out the numbers to say, okay, we are sampling 20 deer, or we got 200 deer back from the taxidermist, and out of 200 deer, we saw 40% with that in it. I think if you could, number one, I'd like to say, out of everybody that's in this room, it's not just about putting corn on the ground. I think everybody that's in this room has vested interest in seeing a better deer population. So thank you guys, number one. But I do want to see if we could come together with some better numbers to inform all of us on how those numbers are. Back in the meeting in Garden City, it was great that you talked about the census and the populations that we had down there. And I think you went into the details about, what's the census versus survey. What I'm looking at, and I'm not going to quote you incorrectly. You said out of 40,000 surveys, you got 12,000. That's 30%. I mean, that's not getting us to a very accurate result. Now, it may not be a population thing, but I do think
What's your question?
to get to real results and numbers. I'm just saying, can we work together to get to accurate numbers on what's being tested so we know what these percentages mean? Is that?
I send out 40,000 surveys because I know that's about what I'm going to get back, is that anywhere from about 10 to 15,000. Typically it's above 12 usually, because that's what, because there's some very good established work that shows that that's enough to get the answer that's accurate enough for what we need. Beyond that, you start getting into the cost of getting more of that back exceeds the actual value of getting that. And there's some very good work that shows that, up to a point, you've got to have more. After that point, you get very little value because it doesn't move the needle very much. If it costs me as much to get, twice as many surveys, but it takes me from, getting to, from 5,000 animals to 5,003, and it cost me twice as much, that wasn't worth it. And so it's balancing that. And the number of surveys is also dependent on the number of different kinds of tags sold. So in some cases, like some of our muzzleloader tags, we sell less than 100 of those a year. And so basically everybody in that group gets a survey, because knowing that I'm not going to get it back from me, I've got to get enough to get to get an actual answer. I can't get 3 back and then say, oh yeah, our muzzleloader hunters harvested 100%. Everyone killed a deer. Unlikely. And so there's a lot of weighing in that.
I was just going to say that Levi's, you're asking some pretty specific questions there about that specific harvest technique, and that's fine. But I just wanted to say, as a whole, the whole research office uses these types of harvest surveys, and we have a great deal of confidence in the results that we get from these surveys. They're all very scientific, and the percentage and the percentage, the harvest or the response rates and the total number of responses that we get back are based on the number of responses we need to have statistically derived confidence in our results, I should say. So it's fair to question them, and we put the harvest reports out there and stuff, but we have a lot of confidence in the results as being accurate.
And I'm not denying accuracy. I'm just saying, when we talk about percentages, and I kind of go back to that the northwest corner, if you say between 24 and 45%, and I jotted something down, how many is that out? I just think sharing with the public the number, I'm not trying to criticize the surveys. I'm just saying we don't have a general sense of what that is in terms of the overall population of that northwest corner. I'm sorry.
And yeah, I apologize. I should have put our sample sizes on there, because we have a sample size we have to get. And if you're lower than that, we can still get that number like that. But the numbers on the edges, they're that 25 to 40, and I can't remember the number now. But those numbers get farther and farther apart. And if you don't have enough, eventually it hits a point where basically it says 0 and 100. Because you don't have enough data to actually do it. So yes, if that's the case, then yeah, we need to be better about, publishing those sample numbers of how many deer are actually tested from those areas. Because that is definitely an important part of evaluating those numbers. So.
Okay, we've got about 35 minutes left. And so we're going to switch to general comment period now. Of course, this is a time when folks can get pretty windy. right? So we're going to limit our time with the microphone to 3 minutes. And out of respect to our elected officials, I will give you the last 5. Are you okay with that? Thank you, sir. Okay. Who's ready for comment?
So since we're talking about this harvest data and these surveys, in this day and age, why are we even bothering with surveys when you have the ability to make us all do a telecheck? I mean, I've electronically checked my deer, make it a statewide mandatory. You have to electronically check in your deer and have that number, just be able to grab that info. I mean, Missouri does that for all their harvest. It's a telecheck system. Why don't we just institute that for more numbers, more accuracy? Well, yeah, sure, I'll let you. I was just gonna refer back to Rich's presentation.
Yeah, so Rich Schulteis, our Assistant Wildlife Division Director, gave a presentation on this just a few weeks ago at the last commission meeting that you can reference on the YouTube video on YouTube. But in short, there's a lot of additional information that we can get from a full postseason harvest survey that, in addition to estimates for actual harvest, we can also get a bunch of other information as well. In addition, there's the other benefits include not putting additional burden on hunters. So for example, you don't have to check in your turkey and your deer and your elk or whatever the case may be. And so we get more information with putting less burden on more hunters that way. Is just one aspect. Again, 20-minute presentation of all the nuances of that, but there's a number of benefits, for both methods. But as a research office, research professionals, we feel like we get the information that we need and as much information as we can from those postseason harvest surveys.
Another way to check in the animal, I do the app when I harvest bird and deer.
In Kansas, you can, and just within the last several years, you had the opportunity to check in electronically, check in deer because you got an electronic license. Previously, you had a paper tag, right? And then that is still an option. Those individuals do not have to call in anything. They don't have to enter anything. They simply take their deer or turkey home, whatever the case may be. And then after the season, there's a chance that they then get an email or a postcard or a letter to return in terms of the postseason harvest survey.
Additional questions or comments?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for everything you guys are doing on spreading this information. I guess number one, as a cattle veterinarian that covers the whole state, I would appreciate to make sure that folks know whenever you're discussing this, we do not have TB and brucellosis within the state of Kansas in our domestic or wildlife species. We have successfully eradicated that. It's if any of those even, think about that disease, it's a reportable disease handled by the Kansas Department of Agriculture. So I just want to make sure that folks understand that they know it's not here, but that's as a general understanding of how disease spreads. Two, I think doing forums like this, and I hope you do, continue and do several more. I think it's a wonderful opportunity to get people behind you and be open and honest that there's a lot that we don't understand about CWD, about how some of these things work, how these things function. But together, when we can recruit ourselves from within, nobody cares more about these deer herds than hunters. So it's a huge opportunity for the department, for hunters, for citizens of Kansas to come together, that when we need to answer some of those questions, people will be more willing to help out. So that's.
I want to thank you all as well for the information you provided. One of the things, however, not really addressed, and I know that wasn't your topic on it, is the recognition of what has been done through the power of our hunting money and licenses to bring us to this level. To be able to handle information, to have a good department and work for this, as well as for wildlife. When I was born and raised, we had 5,000 deer in Kansas. If you saw a deer on the side of the road, you pulled over and stopped because it was a zoo. I mean, that's the only time you're going to get to see it. Now, if you see a deer on the side of the road, of course, it's where's the other ones? So we have had wonderful benefits through the activities and other things through this. So I just hope that we all recognize the efforts that our hunting population has done for us as well.
Who's next? While I'm walking down there, I'll share a personal story. My granddad lived in Neosho County, and he was the mayor of Erie, and he got pulled over by one of his police officers to show him a deer because it was such a rare thing in the county.
My name's George Martinez. I'm from the Wichita area. I hunt a lot out in Comanche and Kiowa County. Been hunting there for about over 40 years, mostly bow hunting, but today mostly what us guys do is wildlife photography. And we've seen it come from where it started. We never baited in the early years. And then when the out-of-state hunting started, it seemed like it built up and there's more and more baiting. And I'm not opposed to somebody having a deer feeder or anything, but when you see hunters that come here and they have a week period and they go and get a whole dump truck load of corn and pile it up where it's 18, 20 inches deep and 20-foot diameter, I mean, that to me is problems. And again, doing wildlife photography and stuff, we've spent anywhere from 60 to 80 days of the year in a blind, either photograph throughout the spring, summer, into the fall, and obviously until they shed their antlers and then start growing again. And one of the comments that I was going to make is on our own little feeders that maybe are just broadcasting. They're not even feeding that much, but you see deer coming in and feeding on them. And then you see the bucks going and hitting the licking branches, and every buck that's coming in there is hitting the same licking branches. So as one is sick, they're going to spread it over time because everybody's licking on that same spot. And so we've got pictures to prove some of the things that you're saying. The predation, when you see bobcats and coyotes and hawks coming in, feeding on the little birds that are eating on the scraps, and the squirrels. I mean, we've caught pictures in action where you get a bobcat attacking a squirrel. And I mean, cool pictures, neat wildlife happening, but I do see the problems where diseases are spread, or you got 30, 40 turkeys all feeding in the same spot and the ground just beat to nothing. And I see it as a problem. To me, again, I'm not opposed to feeding, but if it went away, it wouldn't bother me. You know, wildlife would get back to feeding where it's normally feeding, is on browsing and doing its everyday actions and stuff. And so I appreciate what you guys are putting out. The more we educate our residents and try to spread that to the non-residents, because they're coming in here for a short time and all they're worried about is taking home a trophy deer. So they're going to do whatever it takes to take one home. And I think if you really love wildlife and what we have in the state of Kansas, we need to spread the message together and trying to promote and help them others understand that what a disease can do. That's just my comment. I don't know if these guys feel any different, but so.
Harlan Anderson, Osage County. I was walking through my bean field yesterday and noticed the tops of my beans were not nipped off. And so the next deer that comes through takes a bite, and the next deer that comes through and takes a bite. So how you going to stop that? It'd be the same as feeding.
Okay. Well, you know, in some of that cases, if you're having crop damage, that's a density problem, you know, for your deer to have less problem. This year, though, we're also seeing that there's some drought where we're seeing beans that are actually dropping leaves on their own because they've droughted off. They've not necessarily been nipped off. It's in an area that's got deer damage. You know, I can walk around there and go, that's deer damage. That's not. That's deer damage. That's not. But also when deer walk through plants like that, they are taking the best part of that plant because they need that high, you know, that best nutritional part. And, you know, if you watch a deer walk through an area and watch other deer, they're not going back to that same exact spot. They may be eating another part of a plant nearby it, but they're not going to eat right off that same plant usually because the best part's gone and they can get a better part off of the next one. So that's a big reason why food plots can be a better choice. And the other thing is that that best part, once a deer has eaten it, is gone. And so if you go back and say, you know, look at like a Milo head that a deer eats, they tend to eat the whole thing and it's gone. And the next one not going to eat anything off of that. Doesn't necessarily mean that's always the case, but that's a big part of it is that they're, you know, if you watch a deer browse, they tend to constantly be moving. Now they will stand there, you know, you get in a bean field where there's a lot of really good nutrition in one spot. They'll stand there and take several bites in that spot. But if you could actually see what's getting nipped off, you know, they're not necessarily eating that same part because that stem below those little leaves often is not nearly as nutritious as the leaves that they're eating. So that's a big part of it is that they're not necessarily eating and taking a bite from the same spot in that case.
I would add one more thing to that, and that is deer are going to browse. You know, the difference in those situations are one of them we have no control over. The other one we have absolute control over. So.
More questions or comments?
Thank you. We manage a lot of land. We manage about 23,000 acres plus. I can tell you on every one of those pieces of land what our harvest was. We've talked about this before, Levi, and talked with Brad and several others. Guys come in, people come around, you go to other states hunting, you're going to do telecheck. You're going to check them in. Matter of fact, people are shocked when they don't have to check a deer in, when they just fill out a paper. You know, I've got a lot of land that borders core ground, state ground. And we know how we manage that. But can you tell me or give me any idea at all what your harvest rates are on those public grounds? And I know you do some check-ins, but if you're going to balance, as I've said before, that checkbook, let's put the inputs and let's take the outputs out of it. And we are in 2023. I bet there ain't a soul in here who can say they don't have a cell phone. And to have accurate information, I think some valuable information. And on public ground, first thing I'll ask, you guys are responsible for 300,000 acres. What's your deer density? Which I can't tell you absolute, but I can get pretty close, but I can tell you exactly what our harvest is. Can you tell us that on your public grounds? No. You know, let's just try to all work together and get as much input information, be it sick deer, what we have, if be it numbers, to try to come up with the best results we can in the future. And maybe you do have all that information, but I don't think it's available. And telecheck, e-check is very, very simple. If you need some more information, send out very spotted surveys. The price surprise you if you just put it on the internet and ask for it, what people give you. Thanks, guys. Did a great job too.
Anybody else?
Matthew Newton from Marion County. I don't do much public speaking, so if I mess up, I apologize in advance. I did like the presentation you guys put up. It seemed to have a lot of information on it, but some of the stuff that I was noticing, you know, we're talking about like road collisions or higher densities of deer because of baiting or not because of baiting. I just got permission on a couple of farms this last month And on both of these farms, there hasn't been anybody hunting. I struck a gold mine, I know. Hadn't been anybody hunting in the last 10 years on either one of these pieces. And I've got farms that I've hunted for a couple of years, right down the road. And it's the same population of deer on both sites. You know, it's not an astronomical amount more or less based on feed or no feed. When it comes to raccoons and stuff like that, there's more raccoons on the pieces that haven't been baited than those that have. That might be because I've been trapping and hunting the mess out of them on the farms that I've been having, but still, there's an astronomical number on the places that are not hunted and trapped. You know, when it comes to spreading of disease, you know, we are in a drought. That's pretty obvious. You know, a lot of these deer hitting cattle tanks, water holes, dried up puddles and stuff like that, you know, licking branches. There's a favorite fence crossing that I hunt every year. And for some reason, there's a cattle gate and every single deer that comes by there licks this one gate. I don't know what the paint is on this gate, but man, I'd love to paint it all over the place. But it just seems like a lot of this stuff isn't, the aflatoxins and stuff like that, like someone else mentioned, you know, that corn sits on the ground when a combine drops it or whatever. And someone else also mentioned, you know, that corn isn't necessarily good for deer. You know, where I live, if you find 20 acres of trees, that's a huge block. And they're all surrounded by ag. Where I live, there's very few cattle pastures for the deer to eat natural grass. So they're eating soybeans, corn, and these little patches of grass, but it's really not enough for the deer that's in there. So it just seems like, you know, when it comes to grain or whatever, that's what these deer are eating anyway. And I know we're condensing it in an area, but there's so many other times that they're already naturally condensed anyway. And again, not that I'm not a scientist and I'm not a biologist, I know, but that's just things that I've noticed, and I'm a young guy. So again, I'm not trying to, that's just things that I've noticed. So anyway, thank you guys.
Any other questions or comments?
Do you guys think that CWD positive cases are going to increase at the same rate in eastern Kansas as western Kansas?
Yeah, I apologize. I forgot to answer that part of the question earlier, for you. I've been thinking about it. Possibly they could go faster. You know, it's hard to say. You know, more deer in eastern Kansas, potentially, you know, initially that density, you know, more in a limited area. But maybe not. There's, you know, some of those sources of concentration that occur in the West, you know, deer out there have a huge home range. You know, some of our work in collaboration with K-State shows that, you know, we've got whitetails out there that have, you know, 10, 15 square mile home ranges, you know, as big as the mule deer out there. You know, you look anything else, you know, as you go east, you know, you get down to 1 square mile. So, you know, some of that can play a role in it. Deer may not have to move as much in the east because there's a lot more to eat here. So you may not have that long distance contact. Also limited resources, you know, that may be a case out there. You know, land is owned in bigger tracts in western Kansas. So, you know, fewer people controlling more area. You know, if it's a case of feeders, then there's, you know, fewer feeders in a lot of cases there per square mile. You know, so that, you know, maybe attracting more animals to fewer locations out west and may have increased it, you know, fairly rapidly. But, you know, it's hard to say. If you look at some of the other states that have densities more comparable in the east, you know, it's, you know, maybe that's what we'll have is more of that realm. It's, you know, it's tough because it's just tough to measure it really, you know, trying to get enough samples every year and be able to actually, you know, the financial drain that is, you know, it would be great to get a lot more, you know, I mean, it'd be fantastic. We could sample every deer. We just couldn't ever pay for it. So, you know, it's a lot of balancing that. And so, you know, in some cases, even looking at some of the numbers out west, we went up and down from year to year, but that's more of a case of, that's how many samples we got that year, and that's where it came from. And so it's a lot more important to look over time. And so, if we reach that same level in 18 years, it's going to be really sad. We reach that level in 50 years, it's still really sad, but is that better or worse? We've still reached that level one way or the other. We still have had a major issue for, future deer hunters. So, I hope we don't reach it that fast, but it's just hard to say. There's a lot of factors, and it's just which ones can we control and which ones can't we?
Yeah, I got a question based on time frame. It seems like there's a lot of uncertainty in a lot of this talk. So are we talking like you could potentially be banning feeders next year, 5 years from now? I guess what's the behind the scenes talk on time frame of taking action upon this?
Well, one, we're not talking about that at all. We haven't. When we brought this before the commission in the informational session there, it was outlined that our intent was to have these meetings and talk with folks and get input and provide some best management practices, alternatives. So there's no behind the scenes talk or subversion here. We're trying to get the best information we can out to folks and get some feedback from them regarding what may or may not be feasible and compliable for any potential regulatory action, whether there is or not. So.
You got time for a couple of more. Any more questions or comments?
How bad is it to eat a deer? How bad is it to eat a deer full of alpha toxin? Does it affect us at all?
Don't eat the stomach contents.
I'd be concerned if it's really high. And if it's sick from it, I'd be concerned, I guess, but with a lot of those factors, there's a fair chance that anybody that's eaten deer is eating a deer that's ingested some aflatoxin. It's still all about the dose. I would never recommend that you eat anything. And if somebody knows more, want to tackle that, I would still be concerned if it looks sick. I mean, I won't recommend you ever eat anything that looks sick. So.
No, agreed 100%. When it comes to aflatoxin, the biggest concern for human consumption is either the direct grain or fluid milk. So they found that fluid milk can have transmission. That's why for dairy, like for dairy cattle, they have to have it's recommended an even lower amount to make sure it doesn't transmit to people. Thankfully, monogastrics, there's a difference between, our ruminants can handle a lot more and actually detoxify, but us as monogastrics and pigs, we can't. So that it's a bigger problem, but thankfully it doesn't concentrate in muscle tissue. It's more the grain itself and fluid milk consumption. So.
Hey, sorry guys, I came in late, missed the majority of the talk. So you might have covered this earlier, Levi, but we talk a lot about CWD and I know you're testing a lot of things that go through the taxidermist, and that's a whole nother discussion. But I know you guys also test, I think you do anyways, any reported like deer with acting weird, sick, whatever. Do you have a percentage of how many of those are coming back as CWD by chance?
I'd have to talk to our wildlife disease coordinator to get that number specifically. I'm sure we could provide that. Just that when we're looking at rates for a region, those don't factor in because, if we're detecting it as sick, it's not necessarily a potentially random sampled animal. Again, hunter targeted animals maybe aren't necessarily truly random, but it's a lot more than reporting a rate for every sick animal that we see.
Well, yeah, I'm just curious more than anything because, ultimately, if I'm shooting a deer at 6 years old and it's going to the taxidermist and it's not acting sick, I guess I don't really care if it's got CWD. But I would, if you guys have 500 sick deer and it comes back that 450 of them are acting that way because of CWD, that's going to get my attention, even though it's a small percentage of the Kansas population. Just a thought.
Anybody else?
Make this very quick. How many, first of all, what's the approximation of cost for a CWD sample? And if you don't know the exact number, I'm just kind of curious.
I think the actual test is about $33. And then if you work with the veterinary diagnostic lab here in Manhattan, I think the shipping is going to run you $7 or $8.
Do you have just a rough idea of how many samples, in a county or in a given unit you did last year?
We work on those disease zones that I showed earlier. That's what we aggregate by. It varies by county because in some cases we get a lot from a county because we got a taxidermist that is centered in that and focuses most of the animals they're receiving is coming from that county. That's why some of those counties up there in western Kansas haven't had a positive detection. It's more about we just haven't had enough samples. We haven't, some of those far west counties, we get 5 samples over 5 years. That's probably a lot from that county. Actually, you come to eastern Kansas, some of those will get 20, 30 samples from. So it's not necessarily even. Our target for each of those zones each year is 450 samples. We don't necessarily get that when you start looking at like the Southwest. If we, if I tried to break it down to say management unit 18, which is our most Southwest unit, to get 450 samples, I would have to sample about 85% of the deer harvest from that unit. So, we're not getting that many there, but, we get it spread out. And then the other thing that we can do in looking at some of this is to get, if we don't have enough from one year, we can get more the next year and total it. Cause that's the one good thing about CWD, I guess, if there's a good thing, is that it tends to move slow relative to other diseases. It's not going to burn through your herd like EHD outbreak can. There's time. The trouble is in many cases, we squandered it. So, I'm not sure off the top of my head what it is, but some of those units, like zones out west, we're getting 200 to 300 in a year of the samples. You move to the east, we can typically reach our 450. It's another reason we've also looked at opportunity to, take samples from statewide from people that are concerned and want to send one in, because when we can also get some more information that way.
And I guess that, the information you've already provided saying that you're targeting, 450 in this region, that is so much more information than I've gotten out of the last 6 meetings. Just in terms of getting a rough idea. And I think going back to your, the case that he was talking about aflatoxins, I think the great number of questions I get asked are, how can I eat this deer? What's going to happen if I eat this deer? Because people aren't, I don't know how long a lab test takes to get back, but typically people are eating deer the day they kill it. And so we're hearing a lot of people that are, is it safe to eat? And when you put out numbers that are like 45%, those questions are going to come more, prevalent. So that's why I wanted to try to get a sense. But do you have any feedback on, is it safe to eat a deer that is tested positive after it came back from the taxidermist?
So far, there's never been a confirmed transmission of CWD to human. A lot of laboratory work says that the risk is not zero. And if you take an example of like BSC, mad cow, you know, it's a very low percentage of population that is just predisposed to actually having a problem with that. Really sucks if you're in that low percentage though. And you eat a contaminated hamburger. So again, you know, if it looks sick at all, if it's a positive, you know, throw it out. We're not gonna, you know, you're not gonna get dinged for wanting waste if you throw out a sick deer. You show me a positive test, you know, I'm gonna give you recommendations on how to get rid of it and how to dispose of it so it's not gonna cause any other problems.
And how should they do that?
So best thing, if you have moved it, try to get it into a landfill where it's not gonna get spread out. If you're on the property you harvested it on, I would recommend burying it if possible. At the very least, take it back to where you shot it, because you've already, you know, if that's where that animal came from, it's already there. Don't drag it to a new area and dump it. That's the worst possible thing you can do, is go dump it in a ditch somewhere that is away from where you did take it. But ideally, you'll either get it to a landfill or you'll bury it. And bury it deep. We don't want to have it dug up by a coyote or a dog or something, because, you know, you scraped a little dirt out of the way through it. You know, get it feet deep. There's a reason, you know, you stick, you know, we have a tradition of sticking people 6 feet under the ground. We want it down there. We want it to stay there.
Good evening. And as I said before, I'm Representative Lewis Bloom. I'm on the Ag Budget Committee with Chairman Ken Corbett. We control your budget. This isn't just about baiting deer. This is also about losing our private rights, our private property rights. I'm a farmer, and I'll stand for any questions after this. If I'm wrong, I want to know it. But anybody has a question, I'll be glad to answer it, try to answer it. You're talking about deer density. As a farmer, I've seen 60, 70 deer on top of each other eating beans and corn. You know, you can't control that. And you're worried about feeding corn aflatoxins. How do you control the corn that's left after a combine? You know, so many of these things, I applaud you for your expertise and your work, but some of these things don't make sense. And we know if you're sitting here talking about it, it's coming down the pike. There's no doubt. And that's not just my opinion. You're also now the largest landowners in Kansas. The ground you take care of is a disaster. It's full of cedars, hedge, locusts, and weeds. You are in no position to tell anybody how to take care of habitat, deer, or any other kind. We sat here year after year and you come and bring your budget and we listen to the same thing and you promise to make a difference and you never do. As of today, talking to Ken Corbett, and we have the votes to do this. If you consider thinking about banning baiting, when you come to us this winter, we're going to take $1 million off the top of your budget immediately. And then we're going to recommend we will go through every line item bit by bit and take off everything we can possibly find. This isn't just about baiting deer. This is about losing our freedoms. And we're tired of it. Our constituents are tired of it. You can sit there and say, this probably isn't going to happen. I heard this wouldn't even be discussed a couple months ago. I want to thank you for letting me speak, but I'm telling you, we have the votes to do this. We don't want this rammed down our constituents' throat. We don't want to be told what to do on private ground when we're paying for feeding the deer. It's not costing you one thing to feed the deer. The farmers are doing it. The ranchers are doing it. We're the ones going to the expense. We're the ones seeing how they act. We're the ones seeing how there's tons of them together. We're the ones that see all of this. And then you come and tell us this. And a lot of things you say are true. And I say, I applaud you for your expertise and your work, but a lot of things aren't. A lot of things is about control. And we're tired of you trying to get control of everything. This is our private ground. And we want to keep it private, and we want to have the right to do things on our ground that don't harm anything unnecessarily, but give us the right to do what we want to. Thank you. Again, I applaud you for your work you do and your expertise, but we're tired of this. And if you have any questions for me, I would be glad to answer them. But we have seen this time and time again. Nothing's going to come up. Nothing's going to come up. And pretty soon it's law. It's unfounded, mandated law that we have to pay for, that nobody pays. You send these laws down to us and nobody pays us for them, but we have to pay for them. That's unfounded, mandated laws, and you guys can make them, and we have to abide by them, and it's not right. As I said again, this isn't a threat. I have no way threatening you. As of tonight, we have the votes to do exactly what I said. Thank you for the time, and I appreciate it. Again, I appreciate you, but this is the facts, and this is the way it's going to be.
Thank you, sir. That concludes our meeting exactly on the dot. It's 8:30. Thank you all for coming tonight. I hope you learned a lot. I hope you feel good about the information that you were able to share, and I'm going to turn the microphone over to Mr. Schultes so he can wrap this up.
Yeah, I just wanted to say real quick, I handed out that survey pamphlet questionnaire to all the folks that were in the room. So if you didn't get one, come see me, but we certainly appreciate if you take a minute or two and fill that out. And you can either bring those back to me or leave them on one of the back tables in the back of the room there. Certainly appreciate just some information on, some background, how you feel on the issue, and what you thought about the information we presented tonight. So appreciate everyone's time and attendance. And if no one else has anything, I think call tonight.